Hello! We are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are discussing the bridge between your goals and your achievements, discipline. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through how to master your own mind.
And I am Abel. I am so glad to be here with you, Anna. Many people wait to feel motivated before they start their English practice or their work. Today we want to talk about why motivation is a feeling, but discipline is a choice, and how that choice can change your life.
That is such a beautiful way to introduce our topic, Abel. And I want to start right there with that word, motivation, because I think motivation is one of the most misunderstood ideas in personal development. People talk about it as if it is a resource, like gasoline in a car. They say, I need to find my motivation, or I lost my motivation, as if it is something sitting in a drawer somewhere waiting to be picked up. But motivation is not a resource. Motivation is an emotion, and like all emotions, it rises and falls. It comes and it goes. It is completely unreliable as a foundation for long-term change.
That is so true, Anna, and I feel this personally. I have what I call motivation waves. I get so excited about a new goal. Maybe I decide I'm going to practice English every single day, or I'm going to wake up early and exercise. And for the first 3 or 4 days, I feel amazing. I feel like a new person. But then, maybe on day 5 or day 6, I wake up and the feeling is just gone. The excitement has disappeared. And without that feeling, I don't know how to move forward. So I stop. And then weeks later, the motivation wave comes back and I start again, and the same cycle repeats.
Abel, you have just described the experience of millions of people around the world. And I want you to know this is not a personal failure. This is actually just how human emotion works. Motivation is strongest when something is new. When you begin a new habit, your brain releases a small amount of dopamine, which is a chemical connected to pleasure and reward. That dopamine makes you feel energized and excited. But after a few days, the novelty wears off. The brain stops releasing that dopamine because the activity is no longer new and interesting, and suddenly the excitement is gone. This is completely normal and completely biological. The problem is not that the motivation disappeared. The problem is that people use the presence of motivation as the only reason to act. When the motivation is there, they work. When the motivation is gone, they stop. And this pattern creates a life of inconsistency.
So, what is the alternative? If we can't rely on motivation, what do we rely on instead?
We rely on discipline. And I want to be very careful here to explain what discipline actually is, because many people confuse it with punishment or with being very hard on yourself. That is not what I mean. Discipline, in the truest sense, is the decision to honor your commitment to yourself regardless of how you feel in the moment. It is the ability to say, I do not feel like doing this right now. I feel tired, I feel distracted, I feel uninspired, and I'm going to do it anyway because I made a promise to myself, and that promise is more important than my current emotion. Discipline is not about being a machine. It's about being deeply loyal to your own future.
That phrase, loyal to your own future, I love that. Can you explain it a little more? Because I think a lot of people, including me, feel like when we skip a day or break a habit, it's not really hurting anyone. It's just one day.
That's such an important question, and I want to answer it with an analogy that I find very powerful. I call it the captain and the crew. I want you to imagine that you are the captain of a large ship. You're standing at the front of the ship, and you can see the horizon clearly. You know exactly where you want to go. You've studied the maps, you have a destination in mind. But you are not alone on this ship. You have a crew, a large group of sailors who do the actual physical work of sailing the ship. They pull the ropes, they manage the sails, they keep the engine running.
Okay, I can picture that. And in this analogy, what does the captain represent and what does the crew represent?
The captain represents your rational mind, the part of you that makes long-term plans, sets goals, and understands consequences. The captain can see the future. The captain knows that if you sail in a certain direction, you will eventually reach a beautiful destination. The crew represents your body, your emotions, and your immediate impulses. The crew lives entirely in the present moment. The crew feels tired today. The crew would rather stay in the harbor where it's safe and comfortable. The crew is not bad or lazy. The crew is simply designed to respond to immediate feelings, not long-term visions.
So the crew doesn't necessarily want to make the journey. They just want to rest.
Exactly. And here is where discipline becomes critical. When the captain is strong and clear, the crew follows orders even when they are tired. Even when the sea is rough and the weather is bad, the captain says, "We continue. We do not turn back. We made a commitment to reach that destination." But when the captain is weak, when the captain says, "Well, the crew seems tired today. Let's just stay in the harbor a little longer. Maybe tomorrow the weather will be better." The ship never moves. It just sits in the harbor, drifting slightly, going nowhere. And weeks pass and months pass, and the destination that the captain once dreamed of begins to feel impossible.
This analogy really speaks to me, Anna, because I can see that my captain has been very weak. When my crew, my emotions in my body says, "I don't feel like practicing English today," my captain immediately agrees. My captain surrenders to the crew instead of leading the crew.
And the beautiful thing is that the captain can be trained. The captain gets stronger every single time you choose discipline over comfort. Every morning that you sit down to study when you don't feel like it, every evening that you choose a healthy meal when you want something easy and unhealthy, every single time you honor your commitment when your emotions are pushing you in a different direction, you are doing a push-up for the captain. You're building the muscle of self-leadership. And over time, the captain becomes so strong that leading the crew feels natural, almost effortless.
I really like that idea of building a muscle. But Anna, I want to ask a very practical question because I think many of our listeners face the same challenge. What do you do in the very moment when you feel resistance? When you sit down to study or to work on something important and the resistance is so heavy that you feel like you simply cannot start?
This is where I want to introduce a tool that is one of my absolute favorites for overcoming the initial resistance to starting a task. It's called the 2-minute rule, and the idea is beautifully simple. When you face a task that feels overwhelming or unappealing, you make a deal with yourself. You say, "I will only do this for 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes, and then I'm free to stop if I want to." And you genuinely mean it. You're not tricking yourself. You are giving yourself real permission to stop after 2 minutes.
And does that actually work? Because I feel like 2 minutes of English is almost nothing. It seems too small to matter.
The 2 minutes are almost never about the 2 minutes themselves. They're about something much more powerful. They are about starting, because the hardest part of almost any task is not the task itself. The hardest part is beginning. Our brain creates a psychological barrier around tasks we've been avoiding. The longer we avoid a task, the larger and more frightening that barrier becomes. The 2-minute rule is designed to lower the barrier to almost zero. You're not asking yourself to study English for an hour. You're not asking yourself to write a perfect essay. You're asking yourself to open the book and read one paragraph. Just one paragraph in 2 minutes. And here is what almost always happens. Once you begin, the resistance disappears. The barrier was not real. It was just your brain predicting discomfort that was never actually as bad as imagined.
So the act of starting actually changes how you feel about the task.
Precisely. There's a psychological principle called action motivation theory, which suggests that motivation doesn't always come before action. Sometimes, and actually quite often, motivation comes after action. You start doing the task, even reluctantly, even lazily, and after a few minutes, you begin to feel engaged. You begin to feel interested, and suddenly the 2 minutes have turned into 20 minutes, and you're genuinely focused. This is the opposite of what most people believe. Most people wait to feel motivated before they start, but the truth is that starting is often what creates the motivation.
That is such a shift in thinking. I always believed I had to wait for the right feeling before I could work effectively. but you're saying that the work itself can create the feeling.
Exactly right. And this connects deeply to another concept I want to discuss, which is environment design. Because while the 2-minute rule helps you start, environment design helps you sustain. It makes the act of being disciplined physically easier by changing the world around you.
What do you mean by environment design? Is this about organizing your desk?
It is about much more than that, though organizing your desk is a good place to start. Environment design is the practice of deliberately shaping your physical surroundings so that the behaviors you want to do become easier and the behaviors you want to avoid become harder. The key concept here is what I call friction. Friction is any obstacle that stands between you and an action. When friction is high, you are less likely to do something. When friction is low, you are more likely to do it. And the beautiful thing is that you can engineer friction intentionally.
Can you give me an example? I think a concrete example would help our listeners understand this.
Of course, let us think about your English study habit. If your goal is to practice English every morning for 15 minutes, but your phone is sitting on your desk with notifications turned on and social media is just one tap away, the friction for distraction is extremely low. It is effortless to get distracted, but the friction for studying is relatively high. You need to open the right app or find your notebook or remember which lesson you were on. So your environment is actually working against your goals. Now imagine you redesign your environment. The night before, you place your English workbook open on your desk with a pen next to it and the exact page you need to study already marked. You put your phone in a different room or you put it in a drawer face down. You remove the visual invitation to distract yourself. Now, when you wake up and sit at your desk, the friction for studying is almost zero. Everything is ready and waiting, and the friction for distraction is much higher because your phone is not immediately accessible.
So you're essentially making the right choice the easy choice by setting things up in advance.
Perfectly stated. And this works in so many areas of life. If you want to eat healthier, put the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter and put the unhealthy snacks in a cabinet that requires effort to open. If you want to read more books, put a book on your pillow so you see it every night before sleep. If you want to exercise in the morning, put your workout clothes next to your bed the night before. Every one of these small environmental changes reduces the distance between you and your good habits. And over time, these small reductions in friction add up to massive changes in behavior.
So Anna, I want to bring this back specifically to language learning, because that is such a big part of what our listeners are working on. How does discipline apply specifically to learning English? What does consistent discipline look like for an English learner?
This is something I feel very passionate about, so thank you for asking. I want to share what I believe is one of the most misunderstood truths in language learning. Many students believe that the amount of time they spend in a single session is what matters most. They think, if I study for 4 hours on Sunday, I am doing well. But research and experience both show us something completely different. Consistency across many days is far more powerful than intensity on a single day. 15 minutes of English practice every single day for a month is dramatically more effective than a 4-hour session once every 2 weeks.
Why is that? Intuitively, 4 hours seems like much more time than 15 minutes a day.
When you add up 15 minutes every day for 30 days, you get 450 minutes, and a 4-hour session once every 2 weeks across a month gives you only 2 sessions, or about 480 minutes. So the raw time is actually very similar, but the learning outcomes are completely different, and here's why. Language acquisition, the process by which your brain learns to use a language naturally and automatically, happens through repetition spaced over time. Psychologists call this spaced repetition. When you encounter a new English word or grammar structure today, your brain creates a weak memory trace. If you encounter it again tomorrow, the trace gets slightly stronger. If you encounter it again in 3 days, stronger still. If you encounter it again 1 week later, even stronger. This is how long-term memory is built, through repeated exposure over time with rest periods in between.
So the rest periods are actually important, even the days when I'm not studying?
Absolutely critical. When you sleep, your brain consolidates what you learned during the day. It moves information from short-term memory into long-term memory. This is why students who cram all their studying into one massive session often find that they have forgotten most of it within a week. Their brain never had the time or the repeated exposure needed to build a strong, lasting memory. But a student who practices 15 minutes every day gives their brain daily input and nightly consolidation. They review, they sleep, they review again, they sleep again. The memories become deep and durable, and over months and years, this consistent daily practice creates a level of English fluency that no amount of occasional marathon studying can produce.
That completely changes how I think about my study schedule. But Anna, I want to ask about something that I think is one of the biggest obstacles for people who are trying to build consistent habits. What happens when you break the streak? What happens when you miss one day or even a week? Because for me, when I miss one day of practice, I feel like I've already failed and I give up entirely.
I am so glad you brought this up because this is where so many people who are genuinely committed and genuinely trying, lose everything they have built. And the answer to this challenge is a rule that I consider one of the most important principles of long-term discipline. It's called the never miss twice rule. And the rule is exactly what it sounds like. You are allowed to miss once. Life happens. You get sick, a family emergency occurs, you have an overwhelming day at work, and you simply don't have 15 minutes to practice. That's acceptable. That's human. Missing once doesn't destroy a habit. What destroys a habit is missing twice in a row.
So the rule is, if you miss one day, the next day becomes absolutely non-negotiable.
Exactly. Missing once is an accident. Missing twice is the beginning of a new pattern. And this is where the danger really lies, not in the single missed day, but in the permission we give ourselves after missing a day. When we say, well, I already broke the streak, I already failed, I might as well take a few more days off and start fresh next week, we are allowing a small interruption to become a complete collapse. The never miss twice rule is a circuit breaker. It says, one missed day is simply information. It tells you that something was difficult or that circumstances were challenging. But the moment you miss a second day in a row, you are no longer dealing with circumstances. You are dealing with a choice, and you must make a different choice.
I also want to ask about the emotional side of missing a day, because for me, the feeling of guilt and disappointment is so strong that it becomes overwhelming. And sometimes I think that guilt is actually part of what makes me give up, because I feel like I am already a failure, so why continue?
This is such an important thing to address, and I want to be very gentle here, because this pattern of thinking, I already failed, so I might as well stop, is incredibly common, and it is also incredibly destructive. In psychology, this pattern has a name. It is called the what the hell effect. Once we believe we have violated a rule we set for ourselves, we experience a wave of guilt and frustration, and we respond to that guilt by abandoning the rule entirely. We say, essentially, what the hell, I already ruined it, so I might as well go all the way. This effect explains why someone who eats one unhealthy cookie decides to eat the entire box. It explains why a student who misses one English lesson stops studying for a month. The mistake is not the problem. The response to the mistake is the problem. Discipline is not about being perfect. Discipline is about how quickly you return after you fall.
That reframe is so helpful. So the goal is not zero mistakes. The goal is a fast recovery.
A fast and compassionate recovery. You must be both firm with yourself, firm enough to get back on track quickly, and kind enough to not allow guilt to become a reason to quit. Think of discipline not as a glass that shatters when dropped, but as a rubber ball. When it falls, it bounces back. And the more you practice returning to your commitments after disruptions, the faster and more natural that return becomes. Eventually, missing a day of English practice or a day at the gym feels genuinely uncomfortable, not because you are punishing yourself, but because you have built an identity that includes being someone who does these things.
That word, identity, feels very important here. Can you say more about that? Because I notice that when I talk about my habits, I often say things like, I am trying to study English every day. But you used a different kind of language just now.
Abel, you have just identified one of the most powerful leverage points in all of behavioral psychology. The language we use to describe ourselves is not just a reflection of who we are, it actively shapes who we become. When you say, I am trying to study English every day, you are placing yourself outside the identity of a consistent English learner. Trying implies uncertainty. It implies that the outcome is not yet determined, that you might succeed or you might fail. But when you shift your internal language to say, I am a person who studies English every day, something fundamentally changes. You are no longer someone working toward a behavior from the outside. You are someone expressing a behavior from the inside as a natural extension of who you are.
So the identity comes first, and then the behavior follows.
They reinforce each other, but the identity is the anchor. When you believe something is part of who you are, you protect it differently. If someone asks you to skip your English practice today and your internal answer is, I am trying to be consistent, it is quite easy to make an exception. But when your internal answer is, I am an English learner, this is what I do, making an exception feels like a violation of your own identity. It feels wrong in a deep way, and that feeling of wrongness is incredibly protective. It keeps you consistent even when your circumstances make it difficult.
How do you begin to build that new identity? Because right now, I honestly do not feel like a disciplined person. I feel like someone who is working on becoming one. How do I make the shift?
The shift happens through evidence. Your brain builds your identity based on the evidence you provide it through your actions. Every time you sit down to practice English, even for just 15 minutes, even when you don't feel like it, you are casting a vote for the identity of, I am a consistent English learner. Every time you choose the healthy meal, you are casting a vote for the identity of, I am someone who takes care of my body. No single vote decides the election, but over time, vote after vote, action after action, the evidence accumulates and your brain begins to genuinely accept the new identity as true. This is why the small daily actions matter so enormously. They are not just building skills or knowledge, they are building the story you tell yourself about who you are.
And I imagine that once the identity is truly established, discipline becomes much less of a struggle because you're no longer fighting against yourself, you are simply being yourself.
That is beautifully said, and it is absolutely true. The highest form of discipline is when it no longer feels like discipline at all. When consistency becomes simply an expression of identity, the internal battle quiets down significantly. You still need the captain to lead the crew sometimes. There will always be difficult days, difficult seasons of life. But the captain is no longer fighting a crew that is completely resistant. The crew begins to align with the captain's vision because they have made that journey so many times before. They know the way. They trust the destination, and they trust the captain who has never abandoned them, even on the hardest days.
Anna, I want to ask one final question before we close today's conversation, and I think it's perhaps the most important one. Why does discipline matter so deeply? Beyond the goals, beyond the habits, beyond the English scores or the fitness results, at the most fundamental level, why should someone commit to building discipline in their life?
That question deserves a thoughtful and honest answer. At the most fundamental level, discipline matters because it is the ultimate expression of self-respect. When you make a promise to yourself and you keep it, you are sending yourself a message. You're telling yourself, you matter. Your dreams matter. Your future matters enough for me to show up for it even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one is watching, even when the excitement has faded. Every time you choose discipline, you are choosing to believe in your own worth. You are choosing to say that you deserve the life you are imagining. And conversely, every time you abandon your commitments the moment they become difficult, you are, perhaps without realizing it, sending yourself a different message. You are saying, this is not really important enough. You are not really worth the effort. Over time, these messages accumulate. They form the foundation of your self-image. People who have practiced long-term discipline don't just have better skills, better health, or better language abilities. They have something far more valuable. They trust themselves. They know from years of evidence that when they decide to do something, they will actually do it, and that self-trust is worth more than any single achievement.
Anna, this conversation has genuinely changed something in my thinking. I came into today's discussion believing that I was someone who simply lacked motivation, and I now understand that what I have actually been lacking is a relationship with discipline, a deep, committed, patient relationship with my own future self.
And that relationship, like every meaningful relationship in life, is built one honest, consistent, courageous day at a time. And there is no more worthwhile investment you will ever make in this lifetime.